With a force that set all the cups and plates bouncing, Jackson brought down both fists on the heavy wooden table. "That is enough," he said into the stunned silence. He was on his feet, jerking his broad, bony shoulders back because his arms had been jarred by the blows. "That is quite enough." He didn't shout. He was oddly pleased to recall later, but his voice was deepened by this explosion of long-suppressed anger and carried clearly to the edge of the hall. "I am the lord of this hold," Jackson went on, staring first at Dorst, his milk brother. "I am Ruth's rider. He is unmistakably a dragon." Jackson looked at Brand as the head steward's jaw dropped in surprise. "He is, as usual," and Jackson's glance flickered across Lytle's blankly puzzled face, "in the very good health he has enjoyed since his hatching." Jackson passed over the 4 fosterlings, who were all too newly arrived at Ruatha Hole to start jibing at him. "And yes," he said directly to Delan, his milk mother, whose lower lip was quivering at her nursling's startling behavior, "this is the day when I go to the Smithcraft Hall, where, as you all well know, I shall be served with the food and the courtesy adequate to my needs and rank. Therefore," and his glance swept the faces around the table, "the subjects of this morning's conversation do not need to be aired again in my presence. Have I made myself clear?" He didn't wait for an answer, but strode purposely from the hall, elated that he had finally said something, and half guilty because he had so lost control of his temper. He heard Lytle call his name, but for once that summons did not exact obedience. This time it would not be Jackson who apologized for his behavior. The enormous backlog of similar incidents, manfully swallowed or overlooked for any number of logical reasons, swept aside every consideration now, except to put as much distance between himself and his invidious position, his too reasonable and conscientious guardian, and the obnoxious group of people who mistook daily intimacy for license. Ruth, picking up his rider's distress, came charging out of the old stable, which made his weir. The white dragon's fragile-seeming wings were half spread as he rushed to give whatever aid his mate needed. With a breath that was half a sob, Jackson bolted to Ruth's back and urged him up, out of the courtyard, just as Lytle appeared at the massive hold doors. Jackson averted his face, so that later he'd be able to say truthfully that he hadn't seen Lytle waving. Ruth beat strongly upward, his lighter mass launched more readily than that of the regular-sized dragons. "You're twice the dragon the others are, twice! You're better at everything, everything!" Jackson's thought was so turbulent that Ruth trumpeted defiance. The startled brown watch dragon queried them from the fire heights, and the hole's entire population of fire lizards materialized around Ruth, dipping and swooping, chirping in echoed agitation. Ruth cleared the fire heights and winked into between, unerringly going to the high mountain lake above the hold, which had become their special retreat. The penetrating cold of between, brief passage though it was, reduced Jackson's temper. Since he'd only the sleeveless tunic on, he was actively shivering as Ruth glided effortlessly down to the water's edge. The chill increased his sense of chagrin. To recall his milk brother's sneer briefly rekindled his fury and stopped the chattering of his teeth. "It's utterly and completely unfair," he said, slamming his right fist into his thigh so hard that Ruth grunted with the impact. "What is troubling you today?" the dragon asked as he landed daintily on the lake verge. "Everything. Nothing." "Which?" Ruth turned his head to gaze fondly at his rider. Jackson slid from the soft-skinned white back and encircled the dragon's neck with his arms, pulling the wedge-shaped head against him for comforting. "Why do you let them upset you?" Ruth asked, his eyes whirling with love and affection for his weirmate. A very good question," replied Jackson. "But they know exactly how." This is where all that objectivity of Robin's ought to operate and doesn't. "The Master Harper is honored for his wisdom." Ruth's uncertain term made Jackson smile. He was always being told that dragons had no ability to understand abstract concepts or complex relationships. Too often Ruth surprised him by remarks that cast doubt on the theory. Dragons, particularly Ruth, in Jackson's biased opinion, obviously perceived far more than others credited them, even were leaders like Falar or Lessa or Natan. Citing the Fort Weir leader reminded Jackson that now he had an extra special reason for going to the Master Smith Hall this morning. Natan would be there to hear Wanzor explain his star equations and his theories about the red star and the ordered motion of the stars above Pern. Jackson had been of half a mind about proceeding to the Smithcraft Hall, feeling the way he did, but Natan was the only rider who'd be likely to help him, if anyone could. He straightened up from Ruth's neck and kicked rebelliously at a stone, watching the ripples it caused when it skittered across the surface of the lake and finally sank. Robinson had used the ripple effect to show how a tiny action produced multiple reactions. Shells. Jackson wondered how many ripples he caused this morning by storming out of the hall. And just why had this morning bothered him so? It had begun like other mornings, with Dorsey's trite comments about the oversized fire lizards, with Lytle's habitual query about Ruth's health, as if the dragon was likely to deteriorate overnight, and with Dealan snidely repeating the sickening old hoot about visitors starving at the Smithcraft Hall. Lately, Dealan's mothering had begun to irritate Jackson, especially when the dear soul invariably fondled him in front of her seething natural son, Dorse. All the time-honored, worn-out nonsense that started a day, every day, at Ruatha Hall, the chit-chat which, up until that morning, had been comforting and comfortable, unexceptional, and certainly not upsetting. Why, today, should it jerk him to his feet in a fury and drive him from the hall he was lord of, fleeing from people over whom, in theory, he had all control and right? And there was nothing wrong with Ruth. Nothing. "Oh, I am fine," said Ruth equably, "except that I didn't have time for my swim." Jackson stroked the soft eye ridges, smiling indulgently. "Sorry to spoil your morning, too." "You haven't. I'll swim in this lake. Quieter here." Ruth nuzzled Jackson. "It's better for you to be here right now, too." "I hope so." Anger was foreign to Jackson, and he resented the violence of his inner feelings and those who had driven him to such a point of fury. "Get your swim now, Ruth. We've got to go on to the Smithcraft Hall." Ruth had no sooner spread his wings than a clutch of fire lizards appeared in the air above him, chittering wildly. One brown winked out immediately, and Jackson felt another stab of resentment. Keeping track of him, huh? That'd be one more order from him when he got back to the hold. Who did they think he was, an unbreeched child or an old-timer? He sighed repentantly. Of course they'd be worried about him when he stormed out of the hold like that. Not that he was likely to go anywhere else but the lake, not that he could possibly come to harm with Ruth, and not that he and Ruth could go anywhere on Pern where fire lizards couldn't find them. His resentment flared anew, this time against the silly fire lizards. Why, of all dragons, did every fire lizard have an insatiable curiosity about Ruth? Wherever they went on Pern, every fire lizard in the neighborhood came popping in to gawk at the white dragon. It used to amuse Jackson because the fire lizards would give Ruth the most incredible images of things they remembered, and Ruth would report to him the interesting ones. But today, as with everything else, amusement had soured to irritation. Analyze, Lytle was fond of directing him. Think objectively. You can't govern others until you can control yourself and see the broader, forward-looking view. Jackson took a couple of deep breaths, the kind Lytle was always recommending before he spoke. Ruth had winged over the deep blue waters of the little lake now, fire lizards outlining his graceful figure. He suddenly folded his wings and dove. Jackson shuddered, wondering how Ruth could enjoy the biting cold waters fed by the snow-capped peaks of the high ranges. In the muggy summer heat, Jackson often found it refreshing, but now, with winter barely past, well, if dragons didn't feel the 3 times more intense cold in between, a plunge in an icy lake would be of no account. Ruth surfaced, waves lapping against the bank at Jackson's feet. Jackson idly stripped a branch of its thick needles and launched them one after another into the incoming ripples. Well, one wave of reaction to this morning's outburst was the dispatch of fire lizards to find him. Another, the look of stunned amazement on Dorsey's face. That had been the first time Jackson had ever rounded on his milk brother, though the shell knew it was only the thought of Lytle's displeasure at his loss of control that had kept Jackson's temper in check so long. Dorse loved nothing better than to taunt Jackson about Ruth's lack of stature, masking his malicious jibes in mock brotherly quarrels, knowing all too well that Jackson could not retaliate without a rebuke from Lytle for conduct unbecoming his rank and station. Jackson had long outgrown the need for Dealin's fussing, but innate kindness and gratitude for the milk which had nourished him after his premature birth had prevented Jackson from asking Lytle to retire her. Then Jackson groaned with genuine remorse. He had no excuse for including Lytle in such company. Lytle, who had devoted himself so single-mindedly to Jackson's welfare and with untold personal sacrifice to Ruth's. So why, today, had all this suddenly boiled up? Ruth's head emerged from the waters again, the many-faceted eyes reflecting the bright morning sun in greens and brilliant clear blues. The fire lizards attacked his back with rough tongues and talons, scrubbing off infinitesimal motes of dirt, splashing water over him with their wings. The green turned to batter her nose at one of the two blues and swatted the brown with her wing to make him work to her satisfaction. Despite his mood, Jackson laughed to see her scolding. She was Dealin's green, and so much in manner like his milk mother that he was minded of the weir axiom that a dragon was no better than his rider. In that cause, Lytle had done Jackson no disservice. Ruth was the best dragon in all Pern. And now Jackson recognized the underlying cause of his rebellion, if Ruth was ever allowed to be. All the frustrated anger of the morning returned, disrupting what little objectivity he had obtained at the peaceful lakeside. Neither he, Jackson, Lord of Ruatha, nor Ruth, the white runt of Rama's clutch, were allowed to be what they really were. Jackson was Lord Holder in name only, because Lytle administered the hold, made all its decisions, spoke in council for Ruatha. Jackson had yet to be confirmed by the other Lord Holders as Lord of Ruatha. True, a matter of form only, since there were no other males on Pern with Ruathan blood. Lessa, the only living full-blooded Ruathan, had relinquished her blood right to Jackson at the moment of his birth. More important to Pern's tranquility, there couldn't be blood duels to secure a contended hold. I can't be a dragon rider because I've got to be Lord Holder of Ruatha, Jackson said aloud. Only I'm not really a Lord Holder because I can't go up to Lytle and just say, I'm old enough to take over now. Thanks. Goodbye. Lytle had lost so much. First his own dragon, then his small family to Fax's conquests. All his life now centered on Ruathan fields and wheat, and runners, and how many wary bucks. No. In all fairness, Jackson would simply have to wait until Lytle, who enjoyed vigorous health, had died a natural death before he started holding at Ruatha. But, Jackson continued to himself logically, if Lytle is active so that Ruatha hold is not in dispute, why couldn't Jackson and Ruth occupy their time by learning to be proper dragon and rider? Every fighting dragon was needed now, with red falling from the red star at unexpected intervals. Why should Jackson have to trudge about the countryside lugging a clumsy flamethrower when he could more effectively fight Thread if only Ruth were allowed to chew Firestone? Just because Ruth was half the size of the other dragons didn't mean he wasn't a proper dragon in all other respects. Of course I am, said Ruth from the lake. Jackson grimaced. He'd been trying to think quietly. I heard your feelings mainly, not your thoughts, said Ruth calmly. You sound confused and unhappy. He arched out of the water to shake his wings dry. He half paddled, half flew to the shore. I am a dragon. You are my rider. No man can change that. Be what you are. I am. But not really. They won't let us be what we are, Jackson cried. They're forcing me to be everything but a dragon rider. You are a dragon rider. You are also a Lord Holder. You are a student with the Master Smith and the Master Harper. You are a friend of Meneley, Miriam, Phaleson, Pimer, and Natan. Raneth knows your name. So does Nament. And they know me. You have to be a lot of people. That is hard. Jackson stared at Ruth, who unconcernedly gave his wings a final flick and then folded them fastidiously across his back. I am clean. I feel well, said the dragon, as if this announcement should resolve all of Jackson's internal doubts. Ruth, whatever would I do without you? I don't know. Natan comes to see you. He went to Ruatha. A little brown fire lizard popped into the air above the lake. He looks to Natan. Jackson sucked in his breath nervously. Trust Ruth to know whose was which fire lizard. He'd assumed the brown looked to someone at Ruatha Hold. Now what'll I do, Jackson said as he swung up to Ruth's neck. We go to the Smithcraft Hall where I told the brown to take Natan. Ruth, you're marvelous. He had barely settled himself when Ruth rose from the ground. I've got to talk to Natan today before the meeting. I know. We will not keep Natan waiting. And before Jackson could remind Ruth that they weren't supposed to go between time, they had. Ruth, if Natan finds out we've been timing it, said Jackson as they broke out of between over Telgar. Master Smithcraft Hall was below them. He will not ask. Jackson wished that Ruth wasn't so complacent, but then the White Dragon wouldn't have to take Natan's tongue lashing. Timing was bloody dangerous. I always know when I'm going, replied Ruth, imperturbable. That's something few other dragons can say. They were barely in a landing circle above the Smithcraft Hall complex before Natan on great bronze Leoth burst into the air above them. And how you know how to time it that close, I'll never understand, said Jackson. Oh, I heard when the brown returned to Natan at Ruatha Hold, and just came to that when here. Jackson knew that dragons are not supposed to laugh, but the feeling from Ruth was as close to laughter as makes no difference. Leoth winged near enough to Jackson and Ruth for the young lord to see the bronze rider's expression, a pleased grin. Jackson thought Ruth had said Natan had been at Ruatha. Surely they must have mentioned. Then Jackson noticed that Natan held up what could only be Jackson's weirhide riding jacket. As they circled downwards, Jackson noticed that they were by no means the first arrivals. Ruth landed lightly on the meadow before the Smithcraft Hall, with Leoth touching down the next moment. As Natan slid down the bronze shoulder, his brown fire lizard, Triss, appeared and settled impertinently on Ruth's upper crest, chirping smugly. Dealin said you'd gone off without this, Natan said, and tossed the jacket at Jackson. Well, I suppose you lot don't feel the cold the way my bones do. Or are you practicing survival tactics? Oh, Natan, not you two. Me too what, young fella? You know. No, I don't know. Natan gave Jackson a closer look. Or did Dealin's babbling this morning have real significance? You didn't see Lighthall? No. I just asked the first person in the hole where you were, which was Dealin, and she was weeping because you'd gone off without so much as your jacket. Natan drolly pulled down his lower lip in a trembling imitation of Dealin's best effort. Can't stand weeping women, at least women that age. So I grabbed the jacket, promised on the shell of my dragon to force it about your frail body, sent Triss to see where Ruth is, and here we are. So, did something momentous happen this morning? Ruth looks fine. Embarrassed, Jackson looked away from the quizzical regard of the Fort Weir leader and gave himself a bit more time by shrugging into his jacket. I told the entire hold off this morning. I told Lighthall it wouldn't be long now. What? What tipped the scale, Jackson? Dealin's blubbering? Ruth is a dragon. Of course he is, and Natan replied with such emphasis that Leoth turned his head to look at them. Who says he's not? They do. At Ruatha. Everywhere. They say he's nothing but an overgrown fire lizard, and you know it's been said. Leoth hissed. Triss took wing in surprise, but Ruth warbled complacently, and the others settled. I know it's been said, Natan replied, taking hold of Jackson's shoulder, but there isn't a dragon rider I know of that hasn't corrected the speaker, somewhat forcefully on occasion. If you consider him a dragon, why can't he act like one? He does. And Natan gave Ruth a long, hard look as if the creature had suddenly altered in the last moment. I mean like other full fighting dragons. Oh, so that's it. Look, lad, it's Lighthall, isn't it? He's told you not to let me fight Thread on Ruth. That's why you'll never let me teach Ruth how to chew Firestone. It's not that, Jackson. Then what is it? There isn't a place on Pern we can't get to first time right on. Ruth's smaller, but he's faster. Turns quicker midair, less mass to maneuver. It's not a question of ability, Jackson, said Natan, raising his voice slightly to make Jackson listen to him. It's advisability. More evasions. No. Natan's firm negative cut through Jackson's resentment. Flying with a fighting wing during threadfall is bloody dangerous, Jackson. I'm not impugning your courage, but bluntly, however keen you are, however quick and clever Ruth is, you'd be a liability to a fighting wing. You haven't the training, the discipline. If it's only training, Natan grabbed Jackson by both shoulders to stop him. It isn't. Jackson, I said it's not a question of your or Ruth's abilities. It is solely a question of advisability. It just isn't advisable for Pern to lose either you, young Lord of Ruatha, or Ruth, who is unique. But I'm not Lord of Ruatha either. Not yet. Lytol is. He makes all the decisions. I just listen and nod my head like a sunstruck weary. Jackson faltered, aware he was implying criticism of Lytol, and he oughtn't to. I mean, I know Lytol has to manage until the Lord Holders confirm me, and I don't really want Lytol to leave Ruatha whole. Which is why if I could be a dragon rider, it wouldn't come to that, you see? You see. But the answer's still no. It would just make different ripples, probably bigger ones, wouldn't it? So I've got to muck on as something between everything, not a real Lord Holder, not a real dragon rider, not a real anything except a real problem to everybody. Not to me, said Ruth clearly, and reassuringly touched his rider with his muzzle. You're not a problem, Jackson, but I do see that you have one, said Natan in quiet sympathy. If it were up to me, I'd say it would do you the world of good to join a wing and teach Ruth to chew firestone. For the first-hand knowledge no other Lord Holder could contest. Really? If it were my decision, Jackson, which it isn't and can't be. But, and Natan searched Jackson's face, it's a matter that had better be discussed. You're old enough to be confirmed as Lord Holder, or do something else constructive. I'll speak to Lytol and Falar on your behalf. Lytol will say I'm a Lord Holder, and Falar will say Ruth isn't big enough for a fighting wing, and I won't say anything if you act like a sulky boy. A bellow overhead interrupted Natan. 2 more dragons were circling, and indicated that they needed to land where Natan and Jackson stood. Natan waved acknowledgement as he and Jackson jogged out of the way towards the Smith-Craft Hall, which was rapidly filling. Just short of the door, Natan held Jackson back. I'll see Falar later. And now Natan grinned. But for the sake of the first shell, Jackson, don't let anyone catch you giving Ruth Firestone. And be bloody careful when you go. Over the next few days, Jackson realized that it was one thing to form the resolution to teach Ruth to chew firestone, and quite another to find the time to do so. It was impossible to contrive a free hour. On sober reflection, Jackson had to admit that his days had always been full, with Ruth's care first, lessons, hole duties, and in the past turns, meeting at other holes which Lytol felt he must attend, a silent observer, to extend his knowledge of hold management. Jackson simply hadn't realized the extent of his involvement until now, when he desperately wanted time to himself, which did not have to be explained or arranged in advance. The other problem, which he hadn't seriously considered as a hazard, was that no matter where he and Ruth went, a fire lizard was sure to follow. Which wouldn't have been so bad if they also weren't the worst gossips in the world. What one knew, the rest soon did. And he surely didn't want them babbling all over Pern that the White Dragon was learning to chew firestone. However, when he suggested to Brand, the hold steward, that there was really no reason for Ruathan fire lizards to accompany him wherever he went, Jackson managed to lose most of Ruth's faithful followers. He obtained firestone easily enough by snitching a sackful from the pile left for the use of the hold's watch dragon. By going between to the most remote mountain spot he could find in his own hold and telling Ruth to send away the one curious fire lizard who did appear, they managed to secure the privacy they needed. Now I can teach you to chew firestone. I know. You think you know. I've been around dragon riders long enough to know that it's not quite so simple. Ruth gave a sniff as Jackson dug out of the sack a lump of firestone the size of his own generous fist. Now think of your other stomach. Ruth lidded his eyes completely as he accepted the firestone. The noise as he chewed the lump startled his eyes wide open and made Jackson exclaim, "Should you make that much noise?" "It is rock." Ruth threw one lid over his eyes as he suddenly swallowed. "I am thinking of my other stomach." Jackson swore that he almost heard the chewed fragments rolling down. The two sat and regarded each other, waiting. "You're supposed to belch." "I know. I know how to belch, but I can't." Helpfully, Jackson offered him another largest piece of firestone. The mastication did not resound so noticeably. Ruth swallowed and settled more onto his haunches. "Oh!" On the heels of the mental exclamation, a rumble started that made Ruth look quickly at his white belly. His mouth opened. With a startled shout, Jackson launched himself to one side, just as a tiny trickle of flame appeared at the white dragon's muzzle. Ruth jerked backwards, only saved from falling off the ledge by the set of his tail. I think I need more firestone to make a respectable flame. Jackson gave him several smallish lumps. Ruth made quick work of the chewing, and quicker work of the eruption of gas. That was much more the thing, said Ruth with satisfaction. Wouldn't do much against thread. Ruth just opened his mouth for more firestone. What Jackson had brought was all too quickly consumed. With it, Ruth managed to sear a fair swath among the rock weeds. I don't think we've got the hang of it. We also haven't burned any thread mid-air. We aren't exactly ready to do that yet, but we have proved that you can chew firestone. I never doubted it. I never did either, Ruth, but we're going to need a lot of firestone at hand until you get the way of sustaining a continuous eruption. Ruth looked so disconsolate that Jackson hastily reassured him, stroking his eye ridges and caressing his head bone. We should have been allowed to train you properly with other weirlings. It's just not fair. I've always said it. You can't help today, but by the holy shell, we'll do it together. Ruth allowed himself to be reassured and then brightened. We will work harder, that's all, and it will be easier with more firestone. Brown will never use as much anymore. He's really too old to chew at all. That's why he's a watch dragon. There was one detail Jackson forgot to consider, which nearly gave away their endeavor. He was at dinner when Ruth let out a mental call for him, an urgent call. Ruth, Jackson said by way of explanation, as he sprang from his chair at the table and raced across the hall to the corridor to his quarters. My stomach burns, Ruth was telling him in great distress. Shells, it's the stone ash, Jackson told him as he ran down the deserted hallway. Go outside, to the fire heights, where Wilf leaves his. Ruth wasn't sure that he could fly in his condition. Nonsense, you can always fly. Jackson was angrily firm. Ruth had to disgorge his second stomach outside their weir. Lighthall might just take it in his head to follow Jackson, to see what ailed the beast to interrupt Jackson at dinner. I can't move. I'm way down in the middle. You're just going to regurgitate the firestone ash. Dragons don't keep it in their stomachs. They can't pass it. It's got to come back up. I feel as if it will. But not in the weir, Ruth. Please. When he reached their quarters scarcely a second later, Ruth eyed him apologetically. A small pile of brownish-gray wet sand exuded steam in the middle of the weir floor. I feel better now. Can you hear Lighthall coming? Jackson asked Ruth. His heart was pounding so hard from his running that he could hear nothing but the beating. Now he dashed outside for a bucket and shovel from the kitchen yard. If I can just get this outside before it smells up the place. He worked fast, and fortunately the ash required only one bucketful. It wasn't as if Ruth had chewed enough firestone for a full 4-hour threadful. Jackson pushed the bucket outside and sprinkled sweet sand on the spot. No Lighthall? He asked, somewhat surprised. No. Jackson exhaled heavily with relief, patted Ruth reassuringly. Next time, he wouldn't forget to have Ruth regurgitate in the safe spot.